up, my friend? Welcome in to episode 4 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, where we have over 300 subscribers this year using our strategic resources, our online community, and they're using those things to outsmart their friends and dominate their leagues and win DFS contests and NFL bets. I'm your host, Mikey Henninger, and today we are going to be continuing our conversation on new faces in new places. Now, if you missed episode 3, we had an amazing discussion about Dave Canales becoming the head coach of the Carolina Panthers, and more importantly, what that means from a fantasy football standpoint. And spoiler alert, it's a really exciting hire if you're a Panthers fan or if you're a fantasy football player. So I highly recommend catching up with that one if you haven't already. Today we are going to focus on Joe Brady becoming the full-time offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills, and more specifically, more importantly, what that means for fantasy football. Now, by the way, we are actually getting really, really close to wrapping up our series on coaching changes in the NFL, and we are going to start shifting our focus moving forward to the NFL draft, which is coming up next month. In fact, the combine is happening as we speak. We're going to focus on NFL free agency, which is always a really fun time. And of course, we're going to talk about what those things are going to mean from a fantasy football standpoint. I actually just started creating my 2024 fantasy football draft guide. Now, that's a resource that my subscribers use to basically crush their friends before the season even begins. But what it means for this show is that we're really close to starting to talk best ball, which is the most addicting format in fantasy football. If you're not familiar, make sure you smash, or even if you are familiar, smash that subscribe button on the BBF YouTube channel so that you can stay tuned. Really quick housekeeping, because so many of you requested this. Now available, if you go to basementbrewedff.com, you are going to find an option for monthly subscription, monthly payment, monthly pricing. There were several of you that requested a monthly option because you didn't want to bite off the annual fee, which I totally get. So now you have two options, annual or monthly. If you wish to be a part of the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football community, just go to basementbrewedff.com. One really quick thing to know about my pricing, by the way, is that I have early bird pricing built into every single month leading up to July. Okay, so for the people who sign up in January, they're getting it cheaper than the people who sign up in February and March, April, May. If you sign up in March, you're going to be getting it cheaper than the people who get it in April and May and June and July. Point is, if you do the thing where you wait until July, you wait till August, you wait till it's fantasy football season, it's going to cost more than it costs now. So just something to know, where if you check my pricing now and you check it in a couple months, it's going to look different. Okay, housekeeping stuff out of the way. Let's get to the fun stuff. So let's kick this thing off talking about Joe Brady, who is now the full-time offensive coordinator for the Buffalo Bills. Now, technically speaking, he's not a new face in a new place. He was on the Buffalo Bills coaching staff last year. In fact, he actually served time as the team's offensive coordinator after Ken Dorsey was let go following a Week 10 loss to the Denver Broncos. Joe Brady was the guy who stepped up and filled in as the team's interim offensive coordinator, and by all intents and purposes, the Bills' offense took off under Joe Brady, leading to a promotion to him being the full-time offensive coordinator for the Buffalo Bills, who, of course, are always expected to be one of the top 5 offenses in the NFL as long as Josh Allen is the guy playing quarterback. Now, if you dig into the splits between how the Buffalo Bills offense performed under Ken Dorsey and then how they performed under Joe Brady, it's night and day. It's a gigantic difference. Alarming in some cases and great in others. Specifically at the individual level, which is of course where we want to look for fantasy football purposes, Josh Allen and James Cook improved dramatically when the team moved on from Ken Dorsey and brought in Joe Brady as the offensive coordinator. But things got quite a bit sticky at the pass catcher level, where Stefan Diggs fell off a cliff. Gabe Davis saw some decline from a fantasy football usage. And we're going to dive into each one of these things and what it means for 2024 fantasy football. But first, right before we do that, one really quick word from our sponsor. If you want to be the ultimate high achiever and make the absolute most out of this one life that you're given, then you need to get in touch with Paul Conley from High Achievers. High Achievers is a mastermind group helping men grow, achieve big goals, and develop friendships that are lifelong and meaningful. Yours truly is a member of this group, and it meets every single week on Thursdays, helping each other professionally and personally, and helping each one of us become better fathers, better husbands, better professionals, better entrepreneurs, better men, and quite frankly, better humans. Get in touch with Paul Conley from the High Achievers using the notes that are left for you in the show notes. All right, so Josh Allen was one of the guys that was a night and day difference under Ken Dorsey versus Joe Brady. So he spent the first half of the season under Ken Dorsey. He played 10 games under Dorsey, and quite frankly, Josh Allen was still terrific, okay? He still averaged 22.5 fantasy points per game, which anybody will be thrilled to have from their quarterback position. But in 9 games under Joe Brady, that 22.5 fantasy points per game, that went up to 26 fantasy points per game, okay? In 10 games under Ken Dorsey, Josh Allen did have 3 different games under 15 fantasy points. In 9 games under Joe Brady, he had 0 games under 16 fantasy points. In the 10 games under Ken Dorsey, Josh Allen did score 20 or more fantasy points in 70% of his games. So he was still great under Ken Dorsey. But under Joe Brady, he scored 20 or more fantasy points in 88.9% of his games. So he was hitting 20 or more fantasy points in 70% of the games he played under Ken Dorsey, and yet still that number improved to 88.9% under Joe Brady. And last but not least, in the 10 games that Josh Allen played under Ken Dorsey, he scored 30 or more fantasy points just one time. I mean, how spoiled do we have to be to say that just one time scoring 30 fantasy points is not great? But then in less games, in 9 games under Joe Brady, Josh Allen hit that mark 3 times in 3 of 9 games. Okay, so pretty much all across the board, Josh Allen had a better second half of the year under Joe Brady than he did in the first half of the year in 10 games under Ken Dorsey. Moving on to second-year running back James Cook. Once again, just like Josh Allen, it was a night and day difference going from Ken Dorsey to Joe Brady for James Cook. So in the first 10 games of 2023, this is under Ken Dorsey, James Cook averaged 12 PPR points per game on 14.4 touches per game, including 2.8 targets per game. So again, just like Josh Allen, not bad. This is certainly useful out of your running back. If you're getting 12 PPR points per game and 14 touches per game, he's giving you low-end RB2, high-end RB3 kind of value. But when the team moved on from Ken Dorsey and moved over to Joe Brady, in the 9 games that James Cook played under Joe Brady, his numbers improved dramatically. He went from 12 PPR points per game to 15.7 PPR points per game. He went from 14.4 touches to 20.1 touches per game, which is a gold mine in fantasy football. You do not find running backs giving you more than 20 touches per game. Okay, so suddenly we have a very safe floor type of running back in James Cook. And oh, by the way, he went from 2.8 targets up to 3.9 targets per game, which, as we discussed about Rachaad White in our last episode, when we were talking about Dave Canales, more targets for running back is the key. It's the gold mine to unlocking more of their floor, but ultimately their ceiling as well. And when Buffalo selected James Cook last year, he was widely regarded as the best receiving back out of that class. So more passing game work for James Cook is certainly not a bad thing. In the 10 games under Ken Dorsey, James Cook had just 2 games where he scored more than 15 or more PPR points. Okay, so 2 of 10 games, he scored 15 or more PPR points. Under Joe Brady, he had 4 games of 16 or more PPR points. So he played less games, but doubled the amount of times that he scored 15/16 or more PPR points. And last but not least, in the 10 games that James Cook played under Ken Dorsey, he failed to hit 20 or more PPR points in any of those games. But in 9 games under Joe Brady, he did it twice. He scored 20 or more PPR points in 2 of those games, including career highs of 25.1 PPR points and 36.1 PPR points. So you have Josh Allen and James Cook, both of which spent 10 games under Ken Dorsey and then 9 games under Joe Brady, and both of which improved dramatically, at least from a fantasy football standpoint. But then you move into the Buffalo Bills pass catchers, and things get pretty disgusting under Joe Brady. So let's start with their wide receiver one, Stefan Diggs. In 2023, Mr. Diggs played in 10 games under Ken Dorsey, and he averaged a sterling wide receiver one, elite level, 20.2 PPR points per game, which included 10.2 targets per game. The guy scored 7 touchdowns, and he had 8 different games over 15 PPR points, 8 games out of 10 over 15 PPR points. Then you get 9 games of Stefan Diggs under Joe Brady. He went from 20.2 PPR points per game down to 10 PPR points per game. Stefan Diggs getting 10 PPR points per game. That actually hurts the heart to even say out loud. He went from 10.2 targets down to 8.3 targets per game. And he scored 7 touchdowns in those first 10 games under Ken Dorsey and 1 touchdown in the last 9 games under Joe Brady. He went from scoring 15 or more PPR points in 8 of 10 games in the first half of the season to scoring under 9 PPR points in 6 of 9 games under Joe Brady in the last 9 games of the season. So the question is that alarming fall off a cliff? And it is alarming. I mean, being a first round wide receiver going from 20.2 PPR points per game down to 10 PPR points per game over about the same sample size, that's a gigantic red flag. That's terrifying. That's alarming. But is that Joe Brady's fault? Or is that a 30-year-old wide receiver who is slowing down over the second half of the season, playing in a city like Buffalo that gets cold during the second half of the season? Ultimately, we don't really know, and that's where it makes sense to move on to the next study, which is Gabe Davis. And Gabe Davis, just like Stefan Diggs, went down. He went backwards. He went the other way, moving on from Ken Dorsey to Joe Brady. In the first 10 games of the season, which as you know by now, were under Ken Dorsey, Gabe Davis averaged a perfectly usable 11.2 PPR points per game in fantasy football, and he did that on 5.5 targets per game. He actually only played in 6 full games under Joe Brady as he dealt with some injuries over the second half of the season. But in those 6 full games under Joe Brady, Gabe Davis went from 11.2 PPR points per game down to 8.3 PPR points per game. And he went from 5.5 targets to 4 targets per game. So we're seeing his usage dwindle. We're seeing his effectiveness dwindle. Going back to the first half of the season, 10 games, Ken Dorsey, Gabe Davis had 4 games over 15 PPR points, but he did also have 5 games under 8 PPR points. But then in the 6 full games under Joe Brady that Gabe Davis played, he had 2 games between 22 and 23 PPR points, so explosive, week-winning type of weeks. But he also had 3 different games out of 6 under Joe Brady where Gabe Davis literally didn't touch the ball. He gave you 3 zeros in PPR leagues in 3 of his last 6 games that he played with Joe Brady. So the question is, again, is that Joe Brady's fault as the offensive coordinator, or is this a career-long, inconsistent wide receiver that started to lose volume to other pass catchers like Dalton Kincaid, Khalil Shakir, especially with Gabe Davis on his way out entering free agency? So that's going to lead us to our next study, which is Khalil Shakir. So Khalil Shakir is where things start to look at least a little bit better for Buffalo Bills wide receivers under the Joe Brady era. So in the first 10 games, which as you know were under Ken Dorsey, Khalil Shakir was a complete afterthought. He averaged 5 PPR points per game, 2.1 targets. He had 9 games under 10 PPR points. He just was not a part of the Buffalo Bills offense. But then in 9 games under Joe Brady, those numbers went up to 10.3 PPR points per game. So he's giving you at least some wide receiver 4/flex value. He went from 2 targets per game to 4 targets per game, and he suddenly had 3 games over 15 PPR points after previously having 9 games under 10 PPR points. But again, now do we give Joe Brady the credit for that kind of not even resurgence, but surgence of Khalil Shakir, a second-year wide receiver that they took in the 5th round of the 2022 draft? Does Joe Brady get that credit? Or was that a product of Shakir getting more playing opportunity, more volume, and more playing time as Gabe Davis started to fade away? So the 2023 campaign basically just left a bunch of question marks regarding the Buffalo Bills wide receiver room. In fact, I would argue that the Buffalo Bills wide receiver room is arguably one of the biggest question marks and storylines going into 2024 offseason, going into free agency, going into the draft. There are a lot of question marks around the Buffalo Bills wide receiver room, and we're actually going to talk about that here in the next few minutes. But just to complete this 2023 roundup for you, if you're wondering about tight ends and more specifically Dalton Kincaid, it was pretty much a wash. It was 50-50 between Dorsey and Joe Brady. Now, he did actually decline under Joe Brady. He went from 10.7 PPR points per game in 9 games with Dorsey down to 9 PPR points per game in 9 games with Joe Brady, but his usage was exactly the same, literally no change. He averaged 5.7 targets per game with Dorsey, 5.7 targets per game with Joe Brady. The difference was the amount of fantasy useful weeks that Dalton Kincaid had. He had 4 games over 15 PPR points under Dorsey, but only 1 game over 15 PPR points under Joe Brady. So again, more question marks among the pass-catching crew for the Buffalo Bills. And we're going to talk about that again in 1 second. But if you were wondering about if there's any other data on Joe Brady, this actually is not his first stint as an offensive coordinator in the NFL. He was the offensive coordinator of last week's team of focus, the Carolina Panthers. Joe Brady was the offensive coordinator for the Carolina Panthers in 2020, and it was bad. It was not good. The Panthers were 24th in scoring, 21st in yards. Brady was once again the offensive coordinator in 2021, but the Panthers got even worse. They were 29th in scoring, 30th in yards. But was that Joe Brady's fault? Or was it the supporting cast fault? Because his quarterbacks were Teddy Bridgewater, P.J. Walker, Sam Darnold, a washed-up Cam Newton, all of which, by the way, are not currently starting quarterbacks in the NFL. His running backs were Mike Davis, Chuba Hubbard, and he did have Christian McCaffrey, but he only had him for 10 games over 2 seasons. And then his wide receivers, he did have DJ Moore, but again, he had Teddy Bridgewater, P.J. Walker, Sam Darnold, Cam Newton. Those were the guys throwing the passes. And after DJ Moore, it was a combination of Curtis Samuel at times and Robbie Anderson at others. So again, the question is Joe Brady an effective offensive coordinator in the NFL? Does he need a strong supporting cast? The evidence would certainly seem to support that, but he does have a strong supporting cast in Buffalo under Josh Allen and Stefan Diggs and James Cook. So let's talk a little bit about what to expect in 2024 from the Buffalo Bills from a fantasy football standpoint. But first, another really quick word from, well, this one's going to be from me. If you're looking for the ultimate secret sauce in your fantasy football leagues, something that I can all but guarantee you your league mates don't even know exists, then you got to get over to basementbrewedff.com and see what we're doing over there. If you're new to the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football channel, then the one thing you need to know about me personally is that I actually quit an ascending decade-long B2B sales career so that I could dive all in 100% and focus only on this fantasy football analysis business. So now I'm spending 30 plus hours per week digging through spreadsheets, looking at fantasy football strategy, and researching every single player on every single team and making it all available to you so that you have a wealth of knowledge at your disposal anytime you need to go in and crush your friends. So Assuming you're the type of person that likes to outsmart your friends, dominate your leagues, win contests on FanDuel and DraftKings, cash in on NFL bets, then you got to get over to basementbrewedff.com, where we already have 300 plus fantasy football players doing just that with our insights, our resources, and our amazing, amazing online community. Plus, the first 3 subscribers that enter promo code INSIDE20, all caps, all one word, they're going to get 20% off their first year subscription over at basementbrewedff.com. So pause the episode and go now. All right, so what does this all mean for fantasy football in 2024? What does it mean about approaching Buffalo Bills players in fantasy football? Quarterback, we're going to skip it. It's obvious. Josh Allen is a bona fide stud at the quarterback position. Quite frankly, regardless of who's offensive coordinator, doesn't even matter. He's a top 3 fantasy football option anytime he's on the football field. We can revisit that discussion in about a decade. At the running back position, it's pretty much wheels up for James Cook. The arrow's pointing straight up on James Cook, especially under Joe Brady, who turned him into somewhat of a workhorse in the 9 games that they worked together in 2023. All of that is with the caveat of if he remains the true name in the Buffalo Bills backfield, meaning assuming they don't make a splash in free agency or make a splash in the draft. Now, it is worth noting that the general public does seem to think that Buffalo will be players in free agency trying to get another running back. Buffalo currently has the 3rd best odds of landing Alvin Kamara, the 5th best odds of landing Austin Eckler, the 6th best odds of landing both Tony Pollard and Derrick Henry, and the 8th best odds of landing Josh Jacobs. Now, to be clear, none of those guys have better than plus 600 odds of landing with the Buffalo Bills, but still, the public does seem to think that Buffalo will be players in the free agency game trying to find another running back. If that happens, we will revisit this conversation, and that is why you need to keep it locked on to basementbrewedff.com. Keep it locked onto this channel, keep it locked onto this podcast, and we'll keep you tuned as to how these players' stocks rise and fall over the course of the next several months leading up to draft season. But as it stands right now, if James Cook stays the only big name in the Bills' backfield, it's wheels up, and there's a lot to be excited about there. But the wide receiver room in Buffalo, this is where things get really, really iffy for the Bills, for their fans, for fantasy football players. You got Stefan Diggs, who's entering his age 31 season, so he's no spring chicken. That's not geriatric in the ways of expecting him to fall off a cliff, but in a lot of ways, we've already seen him start to fall off a cliff, and hopefully that's not age-related. Interestingly enough, it's also seemingly possible that Stefan Diggs quite literally will not be a Buffalo Bill when the first football kick is kicked in September. There is currently a prop bet on BetOnline or anywhere else that you do your betting that Stefan Diggs is on a different team come September. He currently has plus 300 odds to land with his brother in Dallas playing for the Cowboys. Now, that's not necessarily likely that he goes to a different team, but the simple fact that there is a prop bet surrounding the name Stefan Diggs suggests that it's at worst possible that Stefan Diggs is not a Buffalo Bill when the first football is kicked in September. Then you got Gabe Davis, the team's wide receiver 2 from the last couple years. The guy's an unrestricted free agent. He's not expected to be back with Buffalo. It seems like they're going to move on from him entirely. And all of that combined points the arrow straight up for third-year wide receiver Khalil Shakir. And by the way, year 3 is traditionally and historically a breakout year for young wide receivers. And Khalil Shakir is entering his 3rd year in the NFL, possibly as the team's wide receiver 2 if they don't bring in some additional help. And heck, if Stefan Diggs isn't going to be on the team, then technically speaking, Khalil Shakir does have a path to be the team's wide receiver 1 in 2024. Now that's highly, highly unlikely. In all likelihood, Stefan Diggs is back. And even on the off chance that he's not back, there's always the possibility that Buffalo goes and gets a free agent wide receiver. In fact, they currently have the second best odds of landing Davante Adams. Now, they're distant second behind the New York Jets, who are actually favored. They have minus 125 odds to land Davante Adams, and the Bills are plus 800. But they do have the second best odds to get Davante Adams. They have the fourth best odds to land Calvin Ridley at plus 800, and they have the sixth best odds to land Michael Pittman at plus 1,000. Now, of course, it sounds like Pittman's going to stay in Indianapolis. It's also, by the way, entirely possible that DeAndre Hopkins finds his way out of Tennessee, and the whole Hopkins to Buffalo conversation restarts from where it was last year. But the point is, Buffalo does very much seem to be in the market for a wide receiver, whether it's through free agency or even in the draft, where they have picks 28 and 60. It's entirely possible they use one or both of those picks on a new wide receiver. And all of this, by the way, is once again why you need to stay locked onto basementbrewedff.com, subscribe to the channel, so that you're staying tuned on the Buffalo Bills depth chart, and more importantly, what it all means for 2024 fantasy football. As for the tight end position with Dalton Kincaid, arrows pointing straight up. Wheels up on Dalton Kincaid in year 2. It's entirely possible that this guy serves as the team's de facto wide receiver 2. It's entirely possible he finishes as high as second on the team in targets behind Stefan Diggs, and we saw him flash last year when given the chance. We've seen the athleticism that made him a first-round pick with the Buffalo Bills in 2023. That's all I got for you on episode 4 of BBFF's Inside the 20, which I know, blow the whistle, Tanner. It's becoming comical at this point. Delay a game, 5-yard penalty. We're back behind the 25, maybe even behind the 30. I don't know, but hopefully you liked this episode. And if you did, and you're listening on podcast, please take 30 seconds. I promise that's all it takes to leave a 5-star rating and review. I can't emphasize enough how much that helps me not only chase this childhood dream, but build this teeny tiny business that I'm building. If you're watching on YouTube, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football channel. That way you do stay tuned to everything that's to come with free agency and the NFL draft and best ball contests and draft content. Subscribing is the only way to stay on top of all that stuff. If you have a question or a request for content or something you would like to see or hear discussed on one of these future episodes of BBFF, please, by all means, feel free to drop them in the comments of the YouTube channel. Please feel free to hit me up on TikTok or Twitter, both of which are at BBFF Mikey. Hit me up on LinkedIn, Mikey Henninger. Otherwise, come back on Friday morning for episode 5 of BBFF's Inside the 20. And whenever you're ready to join 300 plus fantasy football players who are outsmarting their friends and dominating their leagues, head on over to basementbrewedff.com and choose whichever subscription package makes the most sense for you. And if you choose the annual package, feel free to give promo code INSIDE20 a try, because the first 3 people who use that promo code, they're going to get 20% off their annual subscription for the first year. That's all I got for you today. I'll see you on the fantasy football field on Friday morning. Cheers. This brew is for you.